Today, Dr. Adrian Chastain Weimer will be interviewing Dr. Carla Pestana about Dr. Pestana's new book, The World of Plymouth Plantation. Dr. Weimer is an associate professor of history at Providence College. She's the author of Martyr's Mirror, Persecution and Holiness in Early New England, as well as other works. Dr. Pestana is the author of numerous works on early America and the Atlantic world. She is professor of history at UCLA and holds the Joyce Appleby Endowed Chair of America in the World. And Adrian, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Frank. I'm thrilled to interview Professor Pestana for the Congregational Library about this wonderful work, The World of Plymouth Plantation. It's such a great achievement because it's both deeply learned and it's a great read. It was a page turner and just accessible to a broad audience. So I'm excited for this book to have a broad audience. And I wanted to start first by asking you about your expansive approach to early Plymouth. You know, in the book you mentioned that when Samuel Eliot Morison was editing William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation, he pulled the letters out into an appendix. And I wonder if you would speak to why you think the letters in their original place are important for our view of Plymouth's history.
Well, thank you both for having me to speak. And I did for this book go to the Congregationalist Library, so it seems really appropriate to be talking to this, on this platform to this community. I think, one thing about Morison's decision is that it violates the integrity of the manuscript, of Plymouth Plantation. Like when you read it, the very commonly available older edition, which luckily has now been replaced by a fabulous new edition, of which Dr. Bremer was one of the editors. You don't get a sense for how he put it together if an editorial decision removes the letters that he used in his account, not only to move the story forward, so sometimes he relied on what was in the letters to tell you things that were going on, but also because those letters really show his outward-looking connection to a lot of other places, in the case of most of the letters, England, but not only England. And I think removing them to make it a narrowly Plymouth story is kind of typical of how we treat Plymouth, but it is not actually a very informative or accurate way, I think, to treat that important document of Plymouth Plantation.
I love the language when you say that Bradford's Plymouth Plantation rested firmly on the edge of the Atlantic and was entangled in a whole web of connections. And I think, what your book does is bring us into those webs of connection. But I think it does it in a really unique way because your chapters are divided into discrete sets of topics. So we have wives, plantations, guns, traders, God, tobacco, so we're able to take this deep dive into these topics, but also an expansive look at these topics. So I wonder how you decided on or developed that structure for the book.
That was possibly the hardest thing. I went into researching the book knowing that I thought Plymouth was a connected place and that was one thing we hadn't really fully explored. And so first I read all the sort of commonly available sources, the court records, the various accounts that were published at the time, the obviously of Plymouth Plantation, a handful of other things. And I just listed all the ways that they documented connections that were important. And then I sort of struggled with how was I going to divide this up. I knew I wanted this to be a book for a popular audience, which I didn't have that much experience with. And so I thought one thing would be to have short chapters. So I started with that idea to kind of frame each one around a thing or a person, a kind of person or an idea that created a connection. And then I thought that those categories were actually typical of Atlantic history. That is, Atlantic history gets you to think about people circulating, ideas circulating, objects circulating, especially with commodity history, but also in other ways. So I kind of brought that Atlantic component in with that structure, and then use the Plymouth sources to talk through some things that it seemed to me were important to them and are sometimes overlooked by us, it felt to me, as I was doing this work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like that you say these were categories, objects, networks that were important to the people at the time, because, it sounds like they emerged right from the sources as you were taking notes initially. And I think one of the issues we run into with the scholarship on early New England is, in my view, we tend to focus on the crisis moments, and in some ways we lose the kind of rhythms of everyday life. And I think that's one thing your book does, is it gets us into what it was like to be there and to engage with these objects and various networks. So your book includes Native peoples, I believe, in every chapter. And one of the things you do is highlight how English people and Native Americans understood common concepts, objects, practices. And you also focus on Native encounters with the English court system. And I think that's one really rich aspect of the book, is that you got into the court records. There's one lesser known episode in Plymouth history that you highlight. There's a murder case of Penowanyanquis. And I wonder if you could speak to why you chose that case to highlight, and maybe what was at stake in the court's deliberations.
Well, in this murder case, 3 men come upon a fourth, and they attack him and they steal from him. They take his clothes, they take some wampum beads he had with him, they take, and they leave him for dead, basically. And he manages to get away from this spot in the woods where they left him, and into Rhode Island, where he's then able to talk to some various people before he dies, including Roger Williams. And on the basis of what he reports, there's a court case built that ends up in the death of 2 of the 3 men. The third one escaped from jail. But I tell this story, and I do it in order to talk about imposing English institutions on this region. I mean, I think about the idea that the English want to make this into a New England, and that idea, that concept that it's a New England, has been thought about in various ways. One of them, I mean, Smith, when he coined that phrase, was making certain claims about the environment and that it would be very similar to England, which turned out not to be true. But in other ways, they want to impose their way of organizing towns and government and the courts. And so I use this to think about the courts as an element of Englishness. And in that case, the murdered man was a native person, and the murderers were all Englishmen. And that was a little bit controversial at the time, but a point that the authorities in particular wanted to make was that the courts would be just, even in such a case. That is, that native peoples could come to the courts. Now, we could be somewhat skeptical about that as a general statement of how English courts would treat native peoples in New England, but it mattered to them in the moment that they do this in a way that was in accord with their laws and treated the murdered man fairly. So in that regard, I thought it was a good example of this idea of importing English institutions, which was both very threatening to native life, but also something that the English who were doing it occasionally, at least, thought of as advantaging or bringing some kind of benefit to native peoples. And we could question that perception of theirs, but I think it was one that they, in their arrogance about their own culture, et cetera, one that they did hold.
It's fascinating. I was just yesterday looking at another murder case that happens in the context of King Philip's War. And it's a somewhat similar case, but the jury doesn't convict the white murderer, and the court keeps sending the jury back. Like, you got keep, and it's you can tell that some of the magistrates are so frustrated, because I think there was, at least, like you say, we could question it, but there was this ideal that the courts were going to serve multiple constituencies. That was part of, they had the certain ideals they didn't live up to. But anyway, I think these cases are so important. Is there anything else you wanted to say about the court records and what they reveal about early Plymouth, or what it was like getting into those?
Well, one thing about the court records, I mean, I've read court records from all over the Atlantic world for the 17th century. So I had that perspective of like, how do these compare to other places? And one thing that jumped right out at me is how typical they are about regulating labor and how many servant contracts they deal with, people being, indentured servants coming and having a contract, people signing up for basically apprenticeships in the colony to learn a skill. And there's lots of this kind of trying to manage the labor milieu. What does a person get when they're done their term of service? Under what terms can they get out of the service? What do you do if the man who is contracted dies and can no longer, use this indenture servant? What do you, how do you then remedy that? There's an enormous amount of conversation about that. And when I speak to groups, and I've been asked to talk to, many colonial groups that are here in California, that the Mayflower descendants, colonial wars, etc., often they're quite surprised. They think Plymouth and New England, I think more generally, doesn't have these kinds of institutions. It doesn't have indentured servitude. It doesn't have slavery. And in fact, of course, scholars know that that's not true. But I think as you read through these records, it's quite apparent that this was very important for them, understandably so. They're trying to, work this new community with few people. And lots to do. And so these are the kind of mechanisms for organizing people into, working for you. And, that is all over the records, is this kind of the labor side of things.
How similar, I know you've written a wonderful book on Jamaica recently, what would you say are Jamaica and Plymouth in that regard with the labor contracts? I mean, there's the issue of the extent of the slave population, but with regard to the indentures, are they more similar than different, or how would you compare those?
I would say, okay, so Jamaica is different because it's conquered by the English from another imperial power, the Spanish. So they're already moving into a space that has African slavery and some of these other things already going on, which of course the people who came to Plymouth did not have. So there's some differences on the ground right away that make it hard to compare. But I would say that Jamaica's labor system is much more organized, much more quickly than Plymouth. In Plymouth and in other parts of New England too, you get this constant lament about the inability to get servants, and so there's a lot of a struggle now. Everybody who wants to hire an indentured servant wants to purchase the contract for an indentured servant in the 17th century English Atlantic world would share in those complaints if they, could get together in a tavern and talk about how hard it was to be a planter somewhere. But I think in New England, the volume of it is much less. The numbers of people that can be brought in is much lower. So in that regard, it's different. But I would say that the institution itself is quite similar. The way that it's evolved over time in various English colonies is very similar to what you would see in Plymouth.
That's interesting. So it gets organized more quickly in Jamaica, and the scale is different, but the institution itself is comparable, more similar. I was hoping we could talk about Congregationalism, since we're doing this for the Congregational Library especially. And I think another important contribution of your book is to argue that the Plymouth settlers religiously were closer to the mainstream of Reformed Protestantism. You say that they're less rigid separatists than maybe others have argued. And I wonder if you'd speak further to that, and also how that argument relates to the broader question, which a lot of people are asking right now, of the relationship between Plymouth Congregationalism and Massachusetts Bay Congregationalism.
So the book, being for a popular audience, doesn't get into the fine points of those arguments. And there's a huge scholarship about all of the various ways in which, you know, these different churches interacted and the points at issue and the theology behind them. And this book does not do that. But I was struck when I was working on the Protestant Empire book that I wrote some years ago, that there's something about coming to an English colony in the Americas that undermines separatism, just in a practical sense, because you don't really need to separate literally from your local Church of England congregation, you know, community, if in fact it's not there. You know, so on that very basic level, the kind of political dynamic of being a separatist becomes very different if you are carrying whatever your religion is with you and setting it up. There isn't an established church structure against which you have to define yourself. So in that regard, it always seemed to me that the colonial environment, just from a sort of ecclesiastical political point of view, varied from what people had known when they were in England. And I think also when it comes down to the particular people who come to Plymouth, of course, only about half of the original people had been associated with the Leiden Church. And we, in some cases, we don't know the religious affiliation details of the other group, whether they're, you know, just happy with the Church of England, or if they're more inclined toward a more reformed version of that, though they stayed in England. But they don't, I mean, what they bring from Leiden is a church that's had a certain experience by that time of living in a community where they could do what they wanted and they didn't need to separate. And their leader, who they greatly admired, seems to have somewhat softened his views on some of these issues about how you interact with other religious groups over the time that he was there. So he's not as extreme in his views on this. And they seem to some extent to follow that somewhat more relaxed view. I also think, you know, what happens in Plymouth is it gets overwhelmed by the other colonies. You know, the hundreds of people that go to Plymouth are there for 10 years, and then you have 20,000 people migrating into Massachusetts Bay. So, you know,
Many of
I
whom
mean, you'd have to have a very defined sense of yourself as absolutely different in order to maintain that over a long period of time under those conditions.
Yeah, it's a nice point. And I think also that Robinson was in dialogue with so many different kind of people. I mean, he wasn't somebody who was closed off, right? He had all these conversations going. He was a very, I think in a lot of ways, a broad-minded theologian. He cared about things happening in the Dutch Reformed Church and elsewhere.
Yes, John Robinson was very well regarded in Reformed circles generally. He was not thought of as a kind of major outlier who, you know, who you might not want to associate with by the, you know, certainly by the end of his career.
Terrific. Sometimes Plymouth settlers have been described as ambitious or self-absorbed kind of people aiming to found or build something grandiose. And you describe their story in a strikingly different way. It has elements of that, but I think you're also wanting to draw out the parallels to modern day refugees and to capture the precarity of their situation. I wonder if you'd speak to some of those parallels.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I mean, I started thinking about this around the question of them as pilgrims, because that term is associated with them today. And it was used in the early period that I looked at in connection with the Plymouth people on 2 occasions by 2 people. And they were both thinking in terms of pilgrims as people without a home, people who are thinking about heaven and are wandering the earth, using a passage from the Old Testament. It was a reference to this idea that sounds, that's a lot like what we think of as a refugee. But what's happened in modern American, in American history and US history, is that the idea of pilgrim has been subtly transformed into a purposeful one, in the sense of aiming toward a goal. So people, I did actually have some people, some friends who don't do religious history, think that pilgrim was a category like Congregationalist or Presbyterian or, Anglican or Catholic or whatever, but beyond that, the sense in which it's often used is that they came here to found the United States. They came here, with a particular purpose in mind, and that's the way their story is made important to later US history, is that they came with certain principles that become part of the US self, understanding democracy, religious freedom, etc., but that they came with with that intention. Now, of course, we know, if you really think about that that's silly, because how could they in 1620 be picturing the United States? They couldn't possibly, but in some way that the term has come to be more purposeful, more like a pilgrimage to Mecca or a pilgrimage to a medieval Catholic holy site. And so I wanted to undo that sense a little bit. And what I ended up using in the book is the fabulous passages by Bradford about escaping from England, because these are like refugee, trying to flee against the law, being tricked by their traffickers into losing all their property and being turned over to the authorities. And, when you read his beautiful, compelling, difficult description of this effort that these people are making to get out of England so they can go to the Netherlands, it so resonated for me that it was a kind of pilgrimage narrative. And if you can, in the sense of the wandering, the escaping, the refugee, the purpose that they have is not the one that we ascribe to them, but it's a very different one. And so, I actually thought about them seriously as refugees, and as pilgrims in the sense that they meant it, of people who have no earthly home. Not that they're coming because America is an exceptional place that they want to create, but because they're coming because they just need some place to go where they can do what they want to do while they're waiting for the important thing, which is death and their an eternal life. So, it's in that regard that I thought about these issues.
Well, and that pulls us full circle too, that it's this, that, they're certainly not seeing themselves as the only true church. They're connected to all these other places and groups of Christians. And Frank, I think I do want to say we have another interview on the Congregationalist Library website with Frank Brimmer, done by Charlie Hambrick-Stowe. And you all discussed that issue, I think, as well, with your book, One Small Candle, trying to capture a sense of, the interconnectedness, but also that these weren't people who had this grandiose vision from the get-go, and that they were in many ways just trying to find a peaceful place to live.
I agree entirely. And much of what Carla said, but there is, the refugee part, especially when they're in the Netherlands, where they're trying to adjust to a society which is largely urban and cloth making, having come from rural farm background. And one of the things which is also clear is that they didn't speak Dutch. And so the difficulties of being able to get jobs, perform jobs, even go to the market, it's very much like what some of the refugees from the Middle East experience when they're in parts of Europe these days. So I think that it's a very valuable insight that, that Carl was just talking about.
I love the cover of the book with these wonderful images. I wonder if you'd speak to how you chose it and why these particular objects or images.
You know, I cannot actually take credit for that. I think the publisher decided, which is Belknap at Harvard University Press, decided that it needed to be gold because that's a sort of Thanksgiving Plymouth Pilgrim color. But then they were really struck in a way that you've commented on, and that I have to admit, it didn't really quite occur to me as I was doing it, so much as it does now that I'm done with it, that it was about everyday life, that it was about these small things that were commonplace and made these people connected to other places in one way or another. So they came up, we did debate the images a little bit. We did debate the little icons that are around. There was one they had that I can't remember what it was, but I got them to get rid of it because it just didn't seem right to me. But you know, the other ones are little, you know, there's some reference to each of those in the book. I think, is there tobacco?
Mhm.
Yeah, tobacco. I mean, I have a chapter on tobacco. I have a chapter on books. There's a chapter that starts with a chicken,
Mhm.
which is actually one that a number of people have told me is one of their favorite.
Do
And then
you
there's
want
one
to
on clothing, and actually that one starts my favorite story, which is the stolen red stockings. But you know, these are all just images that spoke to one of the topics that the book was focusing the chapters on.
Since you've mentioned the chicken and the stolen red stockings, I wonder if you want to give us a little more on one of those.
Okay, well, the stolen red stockings, you know, okay, so the common image about Plymouth is, and it's 17th century New England in general, is that these people wore somber clothing, you know, the belt buckles and the buckles on the hats and the dark, you know. And so I found this great case in the court records of a man who was brought up on charges by the grand jury in Plymouth for having red stockings. Now, if you just knew that and you saw this image of gray and black as the only colors to be worn, you would think, oh, of course he's in trouble. He's wearing red. But in fact, the problem was not that the stockings were red, but that they knew that they were not his, because everyone had so few articles of clothing that all their neighbors knew every item that they had to wear, what color it was, etc. So if you suddenly one day have red stockings, that is something that needs to be explained. And that's why his neighbors basically asked for him to explain where he got these red stockings. And so it, you know, and it's funny because basically he admitted to having stolen them off a windowsill in Boston, which he had recently visited, and then carried them home to Plymouth before he put them on, thinking he wouldn't get caught, which of course didn't work. And his punishment was to carry them back to Boston and return them. But, you know, what it shows you is the scarcity of articles of clothing and the fact that all this stuff has to be imported, that it's very rare. And there's lots in the early records about worrying about clothing and how are they going to get more clothing, and, you know, a shipment of shoes or a shipment of cloth has arrived, and there's lots of discussion of it. And so, you know, it was a way to get into this idea that these actual items that we take for granted as available were not, and that they were reliant on transatlantic trade to bring those things to them for quite a while after they got there. They were not producing any of that locally. And so, you know, that was a way, I mean, the stockings are a great way to disabuse people of the idea of the gray and black color scheme, but they're also a way to think about this whole issue of the scarcity and the reliance on ships that bring you these things that you need just to survive.
I love the way you take these anecdotes and then bring them out and develop them and to track these larger connections. And I can say this book is full of those anecdotes. So it's always a pleasure to speak with you, Carla. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and for this wonderful book.
Yes, well, thank you both for having me. This was really fun. And I was happy to be able to talk a little bit about it. So thank you so much.